Going live. G'day and welcome to Pello Talk. I'm Dave Pello, and today I'm going to be joined by Andrew Laming MP. Andrew Laming is a medical specialist, former infectious disease researcher, and now a current Queensland Coalition MP of the federal government. Welcome to Pello Talk, Andrew. Now, tell me a little bit about your opinion. Why don't you
look forward to it from here in Ormiston, Queensland?
Ormiston, Queensland. Tell me about the opinion that you wrote in the Australian just recently. The headline was "Coronavirus: Time to run trials to find paths back to normal life." Do you think we can get back to normal life? Will we have a new normal?
Well, of course, David, things are going to change permanently. We're going to learn a whole heap of lessons. One of the big ones, I think, is about self-reliance. And Australia's economy has absolutely learnt to take things like viral epidemics really seriously. Up until now, it's really been something that was affecting everyone else, but not Australia. So we'll see change there. I think we'll see a renewed respect for our health system. A lot of young people have really lost touch with their health and hospital systems. It's quite a remote thing for them, as I know that as a doctor that that's the case. So now where we're at is obviously making sure that we prepare for the future. We're very, very lucky to have the vaccine capability that we've got. We're very lucky to have the biomedical and research community that we have. But right now we are just trying to map our way through it rather than work out where we'll be at the end of it.
Now, in your article, you mentioned that the coronavirus modelling that's been released is, potentially useful way back when we were considering what our conditions and responses should be in the emergence of this situation. I'm loath to call it an emergency anymore. And you also say in your opening article that we can move on from the modelling of overrun hospital wards because based on the current data, hard numbers, that this is simply not going to happen. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's a controversial view, but it's one that's emerging in New Zealand as well, where both of our economies have really got on top of the hospitalisation piece. So we're still seeing large numbers. New Zealand around 280 per million, Australia around 250 cases per million. But we've, within a 3-week period, really cracked down on those exponential 25% a day rises that we're seeing in other countries. That was really only for a few days. And the lockdowns of late March they bit within 4 to 5 days. And we know that that's about the incubation period of a single infection. So it certainly responded to our lockdowns. New Zealand is looking at Australia because we've had very targeted lockdowns on personal services and large conferences and congregations, but everything else is sort of bubbling away. People forget that we will have a 10% fall in our GDP in the June quarter, not a 50% fall. Unemployment will go to probably 11%, but not 20% as is being modelled overseas. So Australia's been gifted by virtue of its sparse population. So in denser areas like Sydney, with larger ethnic minorities and a lot more intergenerational congregation as well, that was a real factor in aged care facilities and cruise ships. But I think Australia's getting on top of that. We're quarantining all new arrivals. One of the first countries to do that seriously. And I do want to point out that you've got the UK, which as recently as 1 month ago today had the same caseload as Australia per head of population. They've now got 10,000 cases or more. They've got a huge number. In fact, I can get you the latest numbers. And they're dealing with thousands of deaths compared to Australia's 64. So Australia's doing remarkably well. And we think it's partly the health system, partly the sparse population, and partly we're blessed with being outside of flu season, with warmer climates and the ability to react. So all of those things are in our favour. So it means that the completely hysterical modelling, we call it Malthusian modelling, where we just assume that everything will double until everyone's infected, just never looks like happening. There's about 3 days of that incremental, almost exponential growth, not one-to-one exponential, just 25% a day rises. And that would have led to 1 million people being infected by the end of this month in Queensland. So, of course, we know it never stays like that. There's always an intervention. And in this case, public health interventions. They've been extremely effective in Australia. Now, it's not a cause then to unravel and unpick, but Australia now needs to be realising that unless there's a new virus coming along or a mutation or complete stupidity, that we are in a maintenance phase, and now we have the luxury, like virtually no other country, to identify what's really working and what isn't. What's having what you would call a case benefit effect, which is the amount of dollars it's costing, how many cases are we averting? And that's a really important calculation, which hasn't been done really by any country at all. I know that there's been one economic modelling agency that's attempted this. So I'm really encouraging Canberra to bring Treasury and come and talk to public health and better understand what we call high cost, high effectiveness interventions, but there's also low cost, ineffective ones. And the most important in that 2x2 table are super expensive things that do nothing and the uber cheap stuff that is going to get us through this crisis, 95% of it. And that's separating out our seniors, keeping the distancing, insisting on isolation, reducing unnecessary congregation. And that is what's getting 95% of the bang for our buck. So we do have to ask then about the other elements of civil liberty and economy and ask which of those are helping. If they are, keep doing them. But if they're not, the only way you're going to know that is by doing controlled zonal trials where you assess and recheck. About 10 days later, you'll know whether that's worked or not.
Okay, now that's a very interesting concept because I think in your article you mentioned that, and you just said it now, that we're in a maintenance phase where the crucial number is how many active cases we're currently undertaking, how many are currently on the radar. Now, I think the reason I understood from the PR, from the press conferences, and from the hyperventilating media, that the two reasons we were given for the complete surrender of our social liberty and constitutional freedoms was to avoid excessive and unacceptable numbers of fatalities and deaths, and also to prevent the complete overwhelming of our public and private health systems. We only have so many ventilators and so many ICU beds. So active cases, interesting, but are the number of deaths and the number of ICU beds the numbers which we use to sell us this current situation?
Well, we know that we've got around 500 or less. It's falling to closer to 400 people in hospital. That needs to be compared to 300,000 GP consultations for the 2017 flu and 13,500 hospital admissions. When we look at actual ventilation cases, of course, where that number, may be as low as 40 in the country, a touch higher. So we're watching that number really closely. I mean, even if it goes up to 80 or 100, it's well south of the 2,500 that we have ready to go. And the additional 2,500 through ResMed and through basically appropriation of other ventilators, we're going to be ready with in a couple of weeks. So Australia is not going to see overrun hospitals, but it's increasingly the case made. If we don't do these very austere shutdowns, of course, there'll be people dying in corridors. And there's always that bit of modelling to back it up. And that modelling's only as good as the data you put in. And they just assume that every person who gets infected infects 2 or 3 others and nothing intervenes or prevents that. But Australia's contact tracing has been about the best in the world. There's probably one Asian country that's been more aggressive, and that could be Taiwan. But Australia has got on top of it. So when you look at the graphs of cases, the first thing is that Australia is very slow to report recovered cases. So the perception was that these numbers were going up. But in fact, much earlier, that actually capped out, flattened, and it actually started going down, but we were still being convinced that overall cases were increasing. It just happened that half of those cases were actually at home, completely recovered. And of course, there's many other people out there potentially with elevated antibody levels and immunity to COVID through having these subacute exposures, of which we're yet to quantify, but we'll have to. So it has been work done overseas showing that up to 10% of people in Italy and up to 30% of people in parts of China are already immune to this infection. So while it's not herd immunity, it's telling you there's a big proportion of people who have had this exposure, and increasingly we believe they will be, not in a cohort or what we call a subpopulation who's at risk of infection. So I'm not the public health professor here. I'm just pointing out that this data in Australia is really encouraging, but we'll all be here in August with everything locked down, and we can do this for $1 billion a day until we run out of the billions of dollars, which are all being paid for out of taxpayers' money. And the question really is, do we start now in this maintenance phase where there's only one new case in Australia for every 500,000 people each day? One per 500,000 people. Now is the time, I'm arguing, that small little zones should volunteer to do a trial of, we're going to restart our gyms with up to 10 people in. We're going to restart yoga. We may well start personal services where you can go and get your pedicures done in the shopping centre by those little teams of people wearing PPE. And it was easy to be trivial about this and say it's personal services, it's not essential. But we forget that there are literally tens of thousands of people who put food on tables every night because they're doing those pedicures. It's not that pedicures is essential, David, it's because it's actually feeding families and kids. It's keeping people out of adulthood. Very, very important. So we need to say to Treasury, how much is it costing to shut down these businesses? And then go to public health and show me the evidence anywhere that that's actually preventing the spread of cases. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you're getting a pedicure from a person wearing a face mask, you're probably way safer than getting a haircut from a hairdresser that isn't.
Now, in your article, you mention something that I think is a valid comparison. But I guess I want you to detail, perhaps for the audience, why it's valid to compare what we're currently experiencing and doing to the 2017 flu. I don't know if epidemic is too strong a word. However, there were over 1,200 people who died from the flu in 2017, just 3 years ago. 1,200 deaths compared to the current 64. And it looks like the numbers are stabilised, well under control, and not going to approach the multiple hundreds, let alone exceed 1,000. How fair is it to compare the flu to COVID-19?
So the dynamics are slightly different, David, and that's why you've seen a move to 190 countries. At the moment, there's 61 deaths and 6,400 cases in Australia. So my apologies, that's where I got the 64 from. But Australia's death rate's approaching 1%, as a lot of those early cases in the frail, the elderly, those on cruise ships, run their 20-day course, and that's the mean time usually where we see an outcome from a COVID infection. I don't think it's fair to say that it's either the same or different to the flu, but there's no doubt that there's a different and longer potential incubation period, and certainly the fear is that there's that little window of non-symptomatic infectivity period, and we are worried that there can be between 2 and 3 people infected for every COVID case compared to about 1.1 for the flu. So that's the really germane element that is different and not fully understood. And lastly, obviously, flu follows a slightly different pattern. So with COVID, what we notice is that after about 10 days, there's a real cytokine storm, a development of respiratory distress. And then at that case, if you turn in that fork in the road down that path, it's almost certainly going to end up in ICU. And at that point, you're looking at between 30 and 50% mortality. So once you go down that what we call cytokine storm route, it is quite serious. People have been provocatively stating that that having COVID around does not increase your likelihood of death. It just increases your likelihood at the time of getting COVID, and that the odds of you dying in any particular year are no greater thanks to COVID. It just means that if you are going to die, you'll get it when you've got the COVID. So these are very, very provocative statements. But in Italy, when they revised all that data, these huge numbers of people dying from the infection, they found that potentially less than 20% of all those cases the Italians listed in, not very, very precise epidemiological way, only about 20% of them died of COVID. And the rest of them were probably dying of a whole range of other things, but were unlucky enough to contract COVID as well. So teasing that out will take time. But the point we're making is they're both very serious diseases. 2017 was a really serious flu season, right? It's not just the average season. And you're right that there was around 13,000 hospitalisations, and in Australia we're yet to hit 100,000 hospitalisations for COVID.
Now, Catherine Marshall has just added a comment, a question in 2 words: herd immunity. What my understanding, and as somebody who's specialised and expert in this field, correct feel free to tell me I'm completely wrong and educate me and everybody who might think like me. The vast majority of the biggest cohort of age group being infected with COVID-19 is 20 to 29-year-olds. But there is a 100% survival rate for anybody under 55. Doesn't it build herd immunity, natural resistance to this disease, thereby reducing the likelihood of a sudden overwhelming of our health system if we allow the majority of the population in Australia? There's a lot of background noise coming through your mic. I've just muted you for a second while I ask the question. So doesn't it build a herd immunity, which is beneficial and good for us, and isn't it therefore conversely negative if we're locking everybody away, effectively preventing the acquisition of the building of herd immunity, to let lots of young people who will survive this, who won't need an ICU bed if they get it in most cases. Isn't that a good thing for us to get into? Unmuting you now.
So there's definitely no support for following the route of just letting the infection spread, and most would agree that there would definitely be completely avoidable and unnecessary deaths if we were to follow the herd immunity path. But the herd immunity effect is going to come very, very slowly as more and more people have both subacute exposure to it, recover from the case, and then ultimately with the vaccine, you're trying to get to a point where those that are still susceptible to COVID are so few in the community that they're unable to meet and to infect each other. And that's the concept behind herd immunity. So I think that will happen eventually, just as we attempt to do that for flu every year. Each time try to identify the strains, put them into the vaccine, and then pre-populate that vaccine into the most at-risk age group. So those who get it don't die, and those who might die don't get it. So this will obviously be the COVID story. I've always said we're not going to be eradicating this. New Zealand will end its 1 month lockdown next Monday, and they're not going to eradicate it. Their only choice will be to restart the economy before they run out of money, and that means coming back to Australia's level. For Australia, the question is, can we go one step back from our level 2.5 lockdown? And I'm arguing that this is being considered at the moment, and I think that the more pressure that we put for evidence from public health, the better, because I don't think we need to leave them on their own, because I think they'll be paralysed like penguins on an ice floe. All of these experts reluctant to dive in and take responsibility for what could be a lightening of the tightening. So we're learning from Tassie that it can come back. We need to accept that these experiments can go wrong and cause death. So they're going to be very well designed, very targeted, and very, very carefully monitored. But they've got to collect the evidence about what we can do safely, more broadly across the country. And I think that work has to start by the end of April. And keep in mind, all this only started mid-March, David. And we're talking about a 6 month timeline. And here we are 1 month on, and we're talking about a way out. So that is a credit to the way we've contained and maintained the response so far.
I'll throw a couple of thoughts in one final question, and you can respond to all of them or any of them as you like. My first thought is, what steps and what timing do you think is reasonable to consider as an exit strategy from the current emergency conditions that we're currently facing? And secondly, what do we do when the second wave of transmissions happens and the curve increases again?
So everyone's talking about a hard horizon of a vaccine, and we just don't know how far off that is. There's some evidence that we're going to have our first shot at that early next year. So my money is still on some form of vaccination for next flu season. So that's 12 months away. So that 12 months we have to survive, make sure hospitals aren't overwhelmed, avoid unnecessary deaths, completely isolate the aged, the frail, and those with chronic disease. But the rest of it, I think, will be slowly unravelled over the 6 month time frame. But I'm arguing that studies on how to do it need to start immediately. And so I am one of the more forward-leaning. There's been academics coming out in other parts of the world now asking the same question, and you're seeing the US using different states as what are effectively natural experiments to understand whether aggressive contact tracing works better than the lockdowns. So let me just say, there's not enough evidence yet, but we're getting there, and we're going to make sure that if we do these little small trials, that information, if we're taking that risk, we've got to be monitoring super closely, and if it works 10 days later, you need to see a broadening of that. So we'll be following evidence, I hope, and I'm encouraging public health, finally, and it's my key message today, talk to Treasury, because we may have two equally effective interventions, but if one's costing the economy a fortune and one's relatively cheap, you know which one I'd want to go for. Yep. Australians have been incredibly tolerant and understanding. They've been supportive of government, the national cabinet process. We want to let them know that they took us on trust when we dived into a full court press here. Australia is looking like we were rewarded for doing it. We have the luxury of time to plan our way out. It's a very deep basement, David. This is like climbing a fire escape. It's not easy. It's always easy to go on holidays and isolate, but everyone starts to fall apart after a couple of weeks. And we've got to make sure that the population can see that we're not being unreasonably rigid and harsh in our policing of this, which I know is a concern, but also so that we're setting a light under the tunnel and saying this is where we're guiding you.
We've just lost your picture there. I'll switch to me for just a minute, and if you pop back in, hopefully we can let you wrap up your thoughts there, where we'd lost you. Apologies to the viewers for the transmission difficulties there. The corporate satellite is just having a little technical glitch. So in his article, Andrew asks the question, which lockdown measures need to stay and which don't? The distant finish line is a vaccine early next year. And that's what I've heard is best case scenario next year for those. And I think it's a clear statement of the obvious that we cannot have this level of lockdown and restrictions all the way until December or early next year, if the vaccine's even accomplished by then. We certainly need to figure out how we manage the transmission rate without shutting down the entire economy for the best part of a year, 10 months or so, which seems quite ridiculous. I've got some other concerns about all of this, but I want to stick to the article that Andrew Lamming wrote in The Australian, which is a great one. We still haven't quite got Andrew back yet, but this is the article in The Australian. Search for it on Google. I'll also put a link in the description for these videos. Coronavirus, time to run trials to find paths back to normal life. I think it's very sensible to figure out how we can nibble away at these emergency situations. These restrictions, and I think the sensible suggestion is let's start running some trials in some towns and figure out what actually changes if we are allowed out of our house. A very, very sensible step indeed. Well, I'm actually going to let Andrew go because we've kind of run out of time anyway. I was hoping he'd be able to say goodbye, but he's a medical specialist, former infectious disease researcher, and Queensland MP. Andrew, if you're able to be watching right now without us actually seeing you or hearing you, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your thoughts. And I appreciate any politician who's willing to think outside the box, and I'm sure we all appreciate somebody who can offer an original thought, and Andrew certainly does that. I don't agree with him all the time, and I'm happy to argue with people and happy to have people persuade me how I'm wrong. And Andrew's one of those independent thinkers. So it's always fantastic to have a conversation with a politician or a journalist or any other thought leader like that. So Andrew, still not able to join us. Thank you very much. And for those watching, it's very good to have you with us. Thank you for asking questions, leaving comments, and that's where I'll see you. Don't forget to subscribe to email updates at davepello.com, and on all the social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, you can find me by looking for Dave Pello. So that's really good. Thank you to the Pello Talk partners, as always, for their valuable support in keeping this project running. This has been Pello Talk. I'm Dave Pello, and I will see